Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I am Catherine Wygant Fawcett, the Executive Director of the Institute for Family-Owned Business, and I'm very excited because today is my 7th year anniversary with being with the IFOB. So I never started a job working from home, and it's been great ride ever since. So we were remote before remote happened, so that's kind of fun. I have Brooke Stewart here, who is our Director of Communications, joining us today. I'd like to thank Preti Flaherty and Main Biz for sponsoring us today. So we've muted everyone and turned off your video so we can focus on the presentation. And we'll be recording the program for later viewing. We'll also share the slides afterwards and some resources, so you don't have to worry about grabbing those notes. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so please send us your question in the chat feature. We'll answer questions throughout the program. Towards the end of the program, we'll be putting a link into our survey so that we can get your feedback for the program. So please fill that out, because that's how we build our programs for the next year. As many of you know, the IFOB is a nonprofit that helps family businesses succeed. We're offering nearly 75 programs this year, and we just kicked off our Wine and Nine yesterday. It was kind of soggy on the golf course, but we didn't get rained on, and we had lots of people out there to play, ladies out there to play and have some fun, so that was great. So we invite the men and anyone else who wants to come and join us for our 9-hole scramble on September 7th. So we do have some slots in the Wine and Nine if you still want to come. But if you don't want to do that and you want to do short, we can do the scramble. We're going to have a really fun barbecue and prizes, and it's all back on. Last year we couldn't do that, but we're going to do it this year. We work with CEOs, we work with women in family business, we work with the next generation, and we work with leaders in transitions. So today, thanks to Preti Flaherty, we have our second in a series called Legal Lunches, where we pair up the expertise of their lawyers with family-owned businesses. We had a little fun, thanks to Gretchen, who you can see on the screen with the titles. As everyone knows, it's been a rough year last year. We wanted to have some fun, so this is Hit Me With Your Best Shot. And it's for employees, employers, and vaccinations. We have legal expert Laura Rideout, partner with Preti Flaherty, to give us the best practices. And then we have Ginn, Marvin, Innkeeper, and IFOB board member from the Nonantum Resort, to give us her real life perspective on how much fun we're having in the hospitality industry and what's going on. Our next topic for the legal lunches is people are people, the most challenging employee personas and how to manage them. Not that anybody has any challenging employees, but that would be a good one. We'll have Laura Rideout again, and Deborah Whitworth. She's the owner and CEO of HR Studio Group. And then on November 19th, we will have Working for the Weekend, and that will be team safety, including wage and hour, OSHA, and workers' comp in a post-COVID world. Presenters with John Cronin, an associate, and Laura Rideout will be joining us again, and Mike Davis from Industrial Roofing Companies. Our next Fun and Function event is on Thursday, August 12th from 4 to 6 at the Woodlands, so we get to open up again. And we'll be talking with Frances Erbley on stepping up and stepping back, expanding your influence. It's a discussion about leadership and more, and making sure that you have the right people in the right places. We've also just announced our 40 semifinalists for the 21st Maine Family Business Awards. So mark your calendars for October 6th as we celebrate with an in-person and virtual program and announce the winners live like the Oscars. So now I will turn it over to Laura.
Thanks everyone for joining, and Preti Flaherty is very pleased to co-sponsor the Institute for Family-Owned Businesses 2021 4-part legal lunch series. And Catherine, congratulations on your work anniversary. That's great. A little bit about me. My name is Laura Rideout. I'm a partner at the law firm Preti Flaherty, and I practice in the labor and employment and litigation groups. And a large focus of what I do is advising employers about issues related to their workforce, including how to comply with all of these various laws and regulations that govern the employment relationship. And I've been working with clients throughout this pandemic to advise regarding all sorts of COVID-related personnel policy changes and other issues, including return to work mandates, vaccine mandates, teleworking policies, workplace safety, performance management, you name it. And I'm very pleased to be here today to have a discussion with all of you specifically about the COVID-19 vaccine. And with that said, I will turn it over to Ginn to say a few words about herself.
Well, thank you, Laura, and hello, everybody. I'm Ginn Marvin. I'm the innkeeper at the Nonantum Resort in Kennebunkport. We're a family-owned 137-year-old resort. And as you can imagine, the whole vaccine question has been really, really difficult for us to come up with solutions, just like I'm sure it is for many of you. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Laura and I and Catherine and Brooke and Gretchen have met a number of times talking about this, and it's just such a moving target that I'm really intrigued to hear what Laura has to say, and I'm happy to share with you what's happened in our world with it. So back to you, Laura.
So here's our roadmap for today's presentation. I want to start off by going over some poll questions with all of you. And the idea here is that since we cannot be together in person today, we'll use these polls to try to make this an interactive experience so that we're all sort of weighing in on the topics that we'll be talking about today. And Ginn and I can get a sense of what you all are thinking about regarding these issues. And then we'll set the foundation. We'll give you some background information about vaccine distribution. And then sort of piggybacking off of what Ginn just said, this is obviously an area that is evolving and been very challenging and confusing to navigate for many employers. So what I'm hoping to do today is highlight for you where we do have some guideposts, where we do have some guidance from federal government agencies telling us what the parameters are. And we can sort of talk through those and how they might apply in practical situations in the workplace. So with that said, let's get started with these polls. Brooke is going to help me administer the poll. So take a look at the poll question, take maybe 15 seconds or so to answer the question, and then we'll evaluate this. So are employees in your workplace required to be vaccinated? And what I'm seeing here is that the vast majority of people are answering this question no. And then there's one person that is saying yes so far. Okay. All right, we can move to the next poll. Give me a second. Are employees required to be vaccinated? Okay. Are employees requested to provide proof of vaccination to enter your workplace? Bear with me, I'm navigating between my screens here. So take a few seconds to evaluate this one and respond. Okay, so again, I'm seeing that for the most part, people are answering this question no as well, although it's a little more split than the previous question. Go ahead and end the polling so you can see the results of that poll. Does your workplace require only unvaccinated employees to continue to wear a face covering? Okay, so this one's interesting. We're getting kind of a flip here where most people are answering yes to this question. Does your workplace offer any vaccine incentives? Incentives could be paid time off to get a vaccine, wear jeans to work if you get a vaccine. Okay, so here most people are answering no to this question as well. So here's a snapshot with some statistics regarding vaccine distribution. And the sort of takeaway here is that as more and more Americans are becoming vaccinated, restrictions are loosening, employers and businesses are sort of left wondering, how does that translate into best practices for the workplace? And what compliance traps might exist when implementing modified workplace policies and procedures as these circumstances are changing? So what I want to do for you today is highlight some of the guidance that we've received from the government agencies on these questions that I keep coming back to when I am advising clients on these types of questions. And what we have as guideposts is some guidance from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the federal government agency that is tasked with enforcing anti-discrimination laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and others. And this guidance is really focusing on the interplay between the pandemic and these existing anti-discrimination laws. We also obviously have guidance from the CDC, including the recent guidance for fully vaccinated individuals. And we also have guidance from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration on how to mitigate and prevent the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. So if you're not familiar with this guidance, I really can't recommend enough that how worthwhile it is to look it up online and peruse through it. It's very digestible and very readable, and there's a lot of helpful information in there. But what my goal is today is to highlight some of the main points from these various sources of guidance and walk through that with you and sort of apply it in a more practical way. So since the vaccine became more readily available, one question that is being asked is whether employers can require employees to receive a vaccine as a condition of coming to the workplace or as a condition of continuing to be employed with a company. And the answer to this question is yes. In some circumstances, that is the case. It is possible to have a vaccine mandate in the workplace without running afoul of these equal employment opportunity anti-discrimination laws. But this is a situation where just because you can conceivably do something doesn't necessarily mean that you want to do something. And based on those poll results, I can see that most of your workplaces don't actually have a policy mandating a vaccine. If employers are thinking about whether to have that type of a requirement in the workplace, there are a couple of things that we want to be considering. The first thing we want to consider is the fact that this type of policy will implicate protections under the EEO laws, like the Americans with Disabilities Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and also the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act as well. So employers who do decide that they're going to mandate vaccination need to be ready to evaluate accommodation requests. If somebody cannot receive a vaccine because they have a disability or because they have a religious objection. And apart from these compliance related issues, it's also really important to consider how a mandate like this would be perceived in the workplace. It could lead to morale problems. You know, there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy out there, and a lot of this is fueled by misinformation, which is exacerbated by how easily disseminated it is on social media. And so this is one of the things that Ginn and I discussed in preparing for today's remarks is that, you know, in Maine, we kind of have a unique situation where a lot of our businesses are seasonal and there's labor market issues, there are staffing shortages. And so having a policy in place that could alienate staff and lead to people quitting or leading to hard decisions about how to enforce policies and making termination decisions might not be a viable option for a lot of businesses. Ginn, do you have anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, that's something that we have just been wrestling with ever since COVID started, because certainly we want our people to be safe. We want our guests to be safe. Yet when we polled our employees, they said, you don't have the right to tell me what to do, and you don't have the right to ask me to prove that I've been vaccinated. And so when there's a theory reality here, well, actually we do have that right, but if we do, are we going to alienate people? Are they going to quit? Are they just going to go down the street? Anybody on this call who's in the service industry right now, I know knows what I'm talking about. There's just nobody to hire. And so it makes it very difficult to kind of be high and mighty about this. On the other hand, that's a pretty important thing, making sure that your guests are safe, making sure that your staff is safe. So it's led to some really interesting, active conversations here at the Nonantum. And at the end of the day, what we did is we recommend a vaccine. We don't require it. We ask people who are not masked or are not vaccinated to be masked, but we do, again, we don't require, and we don't require proof of vaccination. The quagmire from my perspective is that from just anecdotally, I will say that people who are anti-vax tend to be anti-mask. So our guidance of, well, if you don't want to get vaccinated, that's fine, but please wear a mask, really hasn't worked out. I know that there are people on our staff who are not vaccinated and do not wear masks. And that's a frustrating thing to me, but I don't really feel that I have any course of action. And I know within my industry, that's a big deal right now. And so, you know, sometimes the laws will tell you one thing and your heart will tell you one thing, but the reality of the situation is you need to do something else. And so that's been the kind of summer it is in the service industry. And I'm afraid it will continue to be for a while now, but hopefully someday soon we'll get all this under control and be back to our normal jovial selves, enjoying a beautiful Maine summer as opposed to a rainy Maine summer.
Right. And I think what you mentioned is one of the biggest drivers of, you know, what type of a decision to make when it comes to having a vaccine policy is, can you really have a policy that has teeth behind it? And the real question is, if you do want to mandate vaccines, are you prepared to terminate employees who do not comply with that policy? Otherwise, it doesn't have any teeth, you know, it's not really going to make the intended difference. Just to put all of this in context, I did do a little bit of research before today's presentation, and the commentary I looked at suggests that only a very small portion of employers are either currently requiring or planning to require that their workers get the vaccine, and that number was around less than 10%. So pretty similar to what we polled in our group here today.
Well, the other thing that I think makes it challenging is if you're, for example, if you're at a store or any place you're going to have customers, we don't know what the customers have done. So even if we required of our staff, if we don't require it of our customers, I'm not sure that you're getting the results you're looking for.
That's a really great point, and that is something that I will touch upon later in the presentation when we talk about some of the best practices that we're getting from OSHA guidance about what employers should be doing if they have workers that are exposed to the public or if they have members of the public coming into the workplace. So exactly a business establishment like yours, Ginn. I'm seeing that we do have a question, so I'm going to look at my comment box and see if I can address that. It says, how about employees with natural immunity, allergies to ingredients, or conditions that their doctor recommends that they should not be vaccinated? So this would come up if the workplace did have a vaccine mandate. My understanding of this question is, if we do have a vaccine mandate, what do we do about employees who fall into this category? And what it's looking like to me is that, you know, this is something that could trigger the obligation under the ADA to engage in an interactive dialogue with that employee and to understand, you know, whether this person is entitled to a reasonable accommodation that the business can implement without incurring any undue hardship. So if there was going to be that type of a mandate and these types of situations came up where employees were coming forward and saying, I can't get the vaccine, then the employer would then have to be prepared to evaluate those concerns and figure out whether there was an accommodation that needed to happen. And historically, accommodation requests are an area where employers can get tripped up. There's some risk in that process of getting it wrong. We do see discrimination claims that come out of that process or failures in that process, even unintentional or unknown failures. And so that's another reason why I think a lot of employers just kind of want to stay away from a vaccine mandate and instead, you know, have a policy where it's encouraged, it's recommended. Maybe employers are choosing to educate their workforce about the benefits of vaccination or how to get vaccinated. And that EEOC guidance that I referenced earlier, it had some helpful suggestions about how to do that. So, really good question. And that's exactly one of the reasons why I think some employers are staying away from this type of policy.
Well, what happened with us is, ironically, my daughter was pregnant this year. And so when we stopped wearing masks at work, she didn't feel safe coming to work anymore. Fortunately, she worked in a type of position that she could do from home. So we allowed that to happen, but it becomes very difficult if someone is, for example, a housekeeper. They obviously can't stay home. They have to work here. And so that's, I think, another challenge that small businesses are facing with, the whole vaccination question of how do you make it safe for everyone.
That's right. So this kind of segues nicely into the next slide, which is, short of mandating that employees receive a vaccine, are there other ways that employers can encourage employees to become vaccinated? And I did give a presentation on the same exact topic earlier this year. And at that time, we were still waiting for guidance on this question. And there was this concern that if the employer offers incentives to employees who get the vaccine, are they then running into problems with the ADA or other anti-discrimination laws if there are employees who can't get the vaccine and therefore aren't eligible for that incentive? Luckily, the EEOC weighed in on that exact question and is telling us that it is okay for employers to offer incentives to employees who become vaccinated, but there are a few guidelines. So if the employee got the vaccine voluntarily, either from the employee's own healthcare provider or some other third party like the Walgreens or the pharmacy, and the employer is incentivizing that or the fact that the employee provided documentation of that, then the incentives aren't limited, and that's perfectly acceptable. If the employer is incentivizing the employee to participate in an employer-administered vaccine program, whether the employer is directly or indirectly administering the vaccine, that's a little bit different. And the EEOC is telling us that the incentive, we can still offer an incentive, but it can't be too large. And the reason why is because if there's this really large incentive, then employees could feel that they're coerced or that they're pressured to receive that vaccine. And as we know, when you have a vaccine, when you have the COVID-19 vaccine, you have to do the pre-vaccine screening questions. And so you're disclosing medical information. And that's where it's inappropriate. Employers can't coerce or force employees to disclose that type of information. And that's where these large incentives can potentially become a problem. So the way to get around that is to simply, either not have a very large incentive, which is kind of fuzzy. We don't have guidance on what type of an incentive is too large, or to simply only incentivize vaccination from third parties that are not employer administered.
Laura, I think we have another question in the chat.
Oh, thank you. If you mandate and an employee has an adverse reaction, is workers' comp an issue? That's a really great question. I'm not a workers' comp attorney, and I wouldn't want to give definitive advice about that question. I don't know what events trigger the obligation to report, and I don't know, if that situation would fall under that umbrella or not. I think that my understanding is that because there is a desire to encourage vaccination, and the government agencies want employers to encourage vaccination, I know for purposes of OSHA reporting, for instance, that OSHA is not going to treat that as a reportable incident, at least for a time, because it doesn't want to disincentivize employers from encouraging vaccination or penalize them for encouraging vaccination. So that's one angle. The workers' comp angle, I would probably want to defer to one of my partners who focuses on that area. But I think it would depend on, the policy and the coverage, and something to look into in more detail for sure. So a related question that comes up is whether asking about an employee's vaccination status or requesting or requiring documentation that confirms whether or not the employee has received the vaccination constitutes a disability-related inquiry under the ADA. It's something that is not allowed unless there's a reason for doing that. And the EEOC is telling us that that is not the case. Requesting vaccination status information or proof of vaccination is not a disability-related inquiry. We kind of ask those questions. The catch is that we have to treat that information about an employee's vaccine status as confidential medical information under the ADA. So this means that any information that the employer receives about an employee's vaccine status has to be kept securely on separate forms in separate medical files with limited access to those records, and they have to be stored securely. So the related practical question is, how do we even implement or enforce a policy in the workplace if we have to safeguard this information and no one can know about it? So the rule of thumb is that this information really should only be shared on a need to know basis. And, you may be able to share the information with limited number of supervisory personnel who are tasked with monitoring and enforcing a workplace policy related to mask wearing and that sort of thing. But employers and managers should be informed that this is information that should not be disclosed beyond a need to know basis, and it has to be treated as confidential medical information. This can get a little bit fuzzy because, I think a lot of employees are candid about whether they have or have not received a vaccine. So I think it's an area where, people can get a little too comfortable potentially. It's just important to remember and keep in mind that we are being told that this information should be treated as confidential medical information.
So Laura, what about a place that their people wear a little thing on their name tag that says I've been vaccinated or something like that?
That's a great question. We've been getting questions like that, and I think our general consensus in our group is that we're a little bit weary of those types of things. If employees are voluntarily, wearing the pin or putting a sticker on their badge or something, maybe that's okay. But if the employer is requiring it, then it sort of sounds like we're forcing people to disclose their vaccine status, we're not protecting that confidential medical information. That makes me a little bit nervous, to be honest. And on a related note, so it's okay to ask somebody if they are vaccinated. The EEOC has told us we can do that subject to keeping it confidential medical information. But what we cannot do is ask follow-up questions. So if somebody says no, we cannot then say, well, how come or why not? That is information that goes a step too far. So again, making sure that if there is a requirement that employees disclose this information, which could have value for your workplace planning and understanding risk in your workplace, that managers and supervisors are trained so that they know what are the limits, how do we protect that information, and what is too much information, what is going too far. So one of the ways that employers might encourage and support vaccination is by offering paid time off for employees who need to leave work to go get the vaccine during business hours, or, say the employee has some side effects, isn't feeling great for a few days, offering PTO for that person to take some time to recover. Those are things that are great to do. And there's also a tax credit that some businesses may be eligible to receive if they adopt this type of a policy. So if you're not familiar with this tax credit, I would encourage you to go take a look at the IRS fact sheet on this issue and figure out whether you're eligible and how to claim that if this is something that's of interest. And it's another example, I mentioned sort of the OSHA example, but it's another example of how the government is really aggressively trying to encourage and promote employees and everybody getting the vaccine.
Laura, there's another great question in the chat.
Great. Thank you for reminding. So
that could be my job.
That would be great, Ginn. I have a couple of screens and I want to keep my focus on the presentation. So if you could let me know, that would be helpful. So I just received the question, if we ask those who haven't been vaccinated to wear a mask, could that be considered disclosing confidential medical information? That's a great question. That's actually something I was thinking about too, which is, well, if we're telling people who aren't vaccinated they have to wear a mask, isn't that this? You can see who's vaccinated and who isn't vaccinated, and I think there are probably some policy ways around that. So keep in mind that CDC is telling us and OSHA is telling us that we should fully support and encourage anybody who wants to continue to wear a mask, whether they're vaccinated or not. There are vaccinated people who will continue to want to wear a mask because they feel safer when they do that. I'm going to touch upon this later in the presentation, but there are some fully vaccinated people who need to wear a mask to continue to be safe. The vaccine might not offer them the same level of protection as other people if they have an immunocompromising condition. And so just because someone's wearing a mask does not necessarily mean that that person is going to be unvaccinated. So I think that there's a gray area there that makes it less decisive that that is the same problem as someone requiring someone to wear a badge or that sort of thing. And then I think the other thing that's helpful here is that anytime an employer is adopting a policy that is in alignment with the CDC recommendation or what the public health authorities are saying, state or local, are saying is a good practice to make sure that our workplaces are safe, you're sort of going to be, okay if someone later challenges that practice if what you're doing is consistent with what the public health authorities are saying. And this kind of falls in that category where the public health authorities are telling us that unvaccinated people, it's a good idea for them to be continuing to wear masks. So moving on to the next question, kind of piggyback or dovetailing off of this notion of offering incentives to encourage vaccination, a related question is whether employers can offer incentives so that employees' family members get the vaccine. And we have guidance on this topic too. And you can see how this would happen, especially earlier in the pandemic where the vaccine might not have been as widely available. And so, employers who had access to the vaccine might have been trying to accommodate or help out their employees and offer this service of making the vaccine available to family members as well. But the problem is that the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act can be implicated if there are incentives offered when employers are administering a vaccine to employee family members. And the problem that comes up under GINA is that employers cannot offer incentives in exchange for learning genetic information about their employees. And if the employer is offering incentives to employees in exchange for their family members receiving the COVID vaccine, they are going to be getting that protected information, which is disclosed in connection with those pre-screening questions that we talked about earlier. So, that's a limitation that is not really possible to get around, but employers can offer employee family members an opportunity to be vaccinated free of incentives if they take other steps to ensure compliance with GINA. So, this is something, if this is something your workplace is doing or thinking about, I really urge you to look back at that EEOC guidance and it'll spell this out in more detail for you. I'm not sure it's as much of an issue now where people can just go to Walgreens or go to Hannaford, wherever, and get the vaccine. And we're not having the same limitations that we had 3 months ago, 6 months ago. So this is a topic that Ginn sort of already touched upon. I'll give you a little bit more information about this. EEOC has weighed in on what an employer's obligation is to pregnant employees who are unvaccinated. And really so I want to, when we talk about this, I want to distinguish between federal law and state law. So I'll start by telling you what our guidance is under federal law. And what EEOC is telling us is that employees who are not vaccinated due to pregnancy might be entitled to modifications or other adjustments that allow them to keep working if the employer makes those modifications or exceptions for other employees who are similar in their ability or inability to work. So it's kind of driven by practices for others in the workplace. And then keep in mind that pregnancy in and of itself is not a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. certain pregnancy related conditions might be. And so if a pregnant employee does have one of those qualifying conditions, then that could trigger the need to have a formal reasonable accommodation and interactive dialogue about that. What type of modifications are we talking about here that employers would need to extend to a pregnant employee? Ginn mentioned one of them. She evaluated this with her daughter, and because of her job duties, it was possible to accommodate her by having her telework during her pregnancy. And that's something that they were able to implement, and it sounded like it was a great solution. Other options are changing work schedules, temporarily changing work assignments, leave. Again, if those are the types of modifications that are extended to others in similar circumstances. Now, I said I wanted to focus on the state law nuance, and this is really important because in Maine, the Maine Human Rights Act was modified in 2019, and it actually has a little bit more favorable of a protection for pregnant workers than what the federal law provides. And under this law, it's unlawful to discriminate against pregnant employees by failing to provide a reasonable accommodation unless doing so would impose an undue hardship on the business. So how is that different than the federal law? My reading of it is that under the Maine law, it doesn't matter if we are accommodating other employees who are similar in their inability or ability to work by providing these modifications. Pregnant women are entitled to it as a matter of right. And it also doesn't necessarily matter if she has an underlying condition that would qualify as a disability under the ADA. So in other words, if we're in Maine and we have a pregnant employee who's asking for, an exception or a modification, we should be evaluating that. And if there's a reasonable accommodation that can be implemented without incurring that undue hardship, then that's something we should be doing. So what about fully vaccinated workers? I briefly touched upon this already, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but there are some situations where employers might owe continuing obligations to employees who did become vaccinated. And so, some employers might be asking, we have an employee who's vaccinated and is still asking for these reasonable accommodations. Why do we have to accommodate the person if they receive the vaccine? Isn't that enough protection? And what EEOC is telling us is that we do have to process those requests the same way we would for anybody else, the same way we do in other situations. So we would engage in the interactive process. This process could include seeking information from the healthcare provider with the employee's consent to better understand why the accommodation is needed. And if there is a disability-related need for the accommodation, then the employer would need to explore whether there is a reasonable accommodation that could be provided, again, without incurring that undue hardship. So, I think where this is most likely to come up is if we have somebody who received the vaccine but has an immunocompromising condition, the vaccine isn't going to give them the same level of protection. Maybe there are other things that we need to do to protect that person in the workplace.
Laura, here's another kind of version of that story question. We have a lot of weddings here, and many of our brides have required their guests to become vaccinated or not come to their wedding. And they then say to us, we want all of your staff to wear a mask. And our policy is that our staff, or anybody for that matter, does not need to wear a mask if they're vaccinated. So how do you go across that bridge?
Yeah, that's tricky. How are you handling that when it comes up?
Well, fortunately, so far, all of the workers have said, oh yeah, that's fine. If that'll make her feel better, that's fine. But I just have a feeling one of these days we're going to get to a place where somebody who's vaccinated says, look, I'm fully vaccinated. I'm not wearing a mask. It's hot out there. And I'm not sure what to do about that.
Yeah. I mean, my instinct is you're kind of handling it exactly right, where you just feel it out in every case by case situation where it comes up. So, if you have that type of a situation where a staff member doesn't want to comply with your bride's request, then can you get a different staff member to cover that event? Can you deal with it internally? I'm assuming there's a huge interest in trying to make sure that your guests feel comfortable and have a great experience and give you a good review after. And
Right.
so, you know, trying to honor their requests, I think it would be well within your right to say, you know, we comply, you know, what our practices are compliant with any guidance from the Maine CDC and the Maine Governor's Office on this topic. You know, our practice is not to require vaccinated employees to wear a mask. We don't do that. If that's a problem, you know, we can talk about that, but that's our practice. And you could choose whether or not you're going to honor your guest's request or not. But there's no requirement that you would have to do what that guest is asking you to do, especially if your practices are consistent, as I've said, with what the guidelines are. I really think that's the best way to quote unquote inoculate yourself, is just to make sure you're keeping your thumb on the pulse of what Maine CDC is saying, what the governor's office is saying. And if what you're doing is in the spirit of and consistent with that, then you're going to have a lot of protection and latitude.
Great, thanks.
So I'm going to skip over this one. I don't want to run out of time, but the point really is here that if we do have policies in the workplace related to vaccines or otherwise related to COVID-19, we want to make sure that they're being consistently applied and enforced. If there's a situation where they are not being consistently applied and enforced, that is a way to generate disparate treatment discrimination claims if one protected class of individuals is being impacted by that in a way that others are not. You know, is the policy singling out people of a certain gender or a certain race or color or age or religion? Those are going to be red flag problems that could lead to discrimination claims. And this one is also one I'll skip over pretty quickly. It's really just summarizing and recapping some of the concepts we've already discussed. I will focus your attention on the last bullet. This is what I want to sort of segue into next in our conversation. We've really been focusing so far on what guidance we've received surrounding these anti-discrimination laws and how to sort of incorporate practices and procedures that weave around those legal requirements. I now want to sort of shift our attention and focus on what OSHA is saying employers should be doing to protect unvaccinated workers. Before I do that, though, there is one additional point I wanted to weave in. And this is a question that maybe you thought of. It's a question I've received before. But if the employer does want to have a vaccine mandate, is there any problem with that, given that the FDA has only authorized the vaccine on an emergency use basis? People challenging vaccine mandates have made that argument, and they're pointing to the fact that the statute governing the FDA and the drugs and vaccines that the FDA approves states that those receiving an emergency vaccine must be informed and have the option to accept or refuse administration of the vaccine. So I've had some clients saying, how can we even think about requiring a vaccine if that is what the FDA statute says? At least one court so far has rejected this exact argument and has upheld the employer's decision to have a vaccine mandate in the workplace. So it's going to be interesting to see how these challenges continue to develop. But the rationale in that decision was telling someone that, you know, the person still has a choice whether they want to receive the vaccine or not. But if they choose no, then they just need to find somewhere else to work. So that's not really the same problem. There's also a question of, you know, what is the angle for the private cause of action for someone to sue an employer related to those requirements? And we're going to see probably some changing circumstances on this topic. Montana recently enacted legislation that makes it illegal for employers to require employees to disclose their vaccine status. It makes it illegal for employers to require employees to receive vaccines. So obviously there would be a more direct angle for employees in those states to pursue a challenge than what currently exists. So, you know, we'll have to sort of stay tuned on that one, but so far those challenges have not been successful.
So Laura, my son is a JAG officer in the Army, and the Army cannot require people to become vaccinated. So I think
Right.
that it's interesting the government doesn't think that they can require it. So
it is interesting, especially because I think it's the case that there are some vaccines that certain military personnel have to receive.
Right. Yeah, if it's approved by the FDA, but this hasn't, it's
Yeah,
still
exactly,
emergency. Yeah.
exactly. And I know that there is some deliberation going on at the Pentagon about what's going to happen when the vaccine does receive full approval and whether there will at that point be a mandate. And, you know, there's a lot of people who aren't happy about that. And there's legislation being introduced and sponsored that would prevent that type of situation from happening. So, you know, we'll just have to stay tuned and see how it plays out.
Also, you have another question.
Great. Are there any exceptions for employers that provide healthcare, such as nursing home or elderly care facility? Maine DHHS is requiring vaccination for group home employees, not COVID yet. So that's a really great question. We're going to get into a little bit of this when I start going over the OSHA requirements, which I'll turn my attention to next. Things are going to be different for people who work in healthcare and long-term care facilities. There are different rules and standards that apply in those industries. My guidance today is more general and doesn't really target those particular industries as much. And the rationale for having vaccine mandates is going to be a lot higher in those types of settings and in other settings too, because there's greater risk. That being said, I think a lot of the same questions are coming up about, you know, making sure we don't lose our workers and having a challenging labor market and being able to staff shifts and meet staffing ratios and that sort of thing. It's a lot of the same considerations at play. So as I've mentioned, we are in this situation where an increasing number of individuals are becoming vaccinated. We don't have any more state mask mandates. COVID cases are down, but it's important to keep in mind that we're really not in the clear, and employers are still responsible for ensuring that their workplace is free from recognized hazards. And as I just alluded to, there is a mandatory OSHA standard that applies to healthcare workplace settings. So if that applies to you, you'll want to make sure you review that standard and are complying with it. But otherwise, for industries that are not subject to that mandatory emergency temporary standard, there is guidance that applies for how to sort of morph into this new world where we do have vaccines and the risk is different than it was 6 months ago. So as you're probably aware, the Occupational Safety and Health Act General Duty Clause is implicated by the pandemic. This is a catch-all provision that requires employers to provide employees with a workplace that is free from recognized hazards that could significantly impact health or physical well-being. And employers that don't comply with this guidance from OSHA and CDC related to coronavirus are at a higher risk of an OSHA General Duty Clause citation. And we've seen that under the Biden administration, there's been some increased enforcement and increased number of GDC citations related to the pandemic. So this slide is presenting for you OSHA's recent guidance on this subject. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you know, this guidance is really helpful. And if you haven't looked at it, again, I would encourage you to do so. It's very digestible and there's a lot of good information in there. I also posted a breakdown of the guidance on my firm's website, so feel free to take a look at that if this interests you. But in a nutshell, for workplaces where there are unvaccinated workers or workers who are otherwise at risk, so maybe those, if there are workers who are immunocompromised, OSHA is recommending that employers implement what they are calling multi-layered interventions to protect those workers and to mitigate and prevent the spread of COVID-19. Remember that this is not going to be a one-size-fits-all scenario, and employers should be evaluating their workplace, assessing potential exposure scenarios, and implementing these interventions that are most appropriate and best suited for their environment. And I want to highlight for you the bullet point that's embedded in the middle of this page, which describes OSHA's recommendation that employers suggest to members of the public that if they are unvaccinated, that they wear face coverings when they enter the business establishment. So customers, visitors, guests. That's something that OSHA is telling employers that they should be doing in order to protect these unvaccinated or at-risk workers. So that's something that's worthwhile to consider. And it sounds, Ginn, like that's consistent with what you're doing at your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. We continue to have the hand sanitizer around. We continue to work with our people to monitor how, they're cleaning rooms, making sure they're wearing their safety gear, gloves, eye guards, that sort of thing. And because it is easy to kind of feel complacent about all this.
Yep.
And we're not out of the woods yet. And so just reminding people of that and talking about it, I think, is a really important thing for businesses to do to keep their workers safe.
Yep, a lot of these institutional, administrative, engineering controls that we had to come up with and adapt to and create 9 months ago, 10 months ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, they're not obsolete now. There might still be a place for those. It really just depends on the workplace and evaluating what the risk is and what the hazard is, which is what OSHA tells us we should be doing. So what does Maine CDC say? Anyone not fully vaccinated should continue to wear face coverings in public indoor settings. What does the Maine Governor's Office say? Business and private organizations can adopt policies for their employees and clients that require wearing a mask, requiring vaccination, or requiring proof of vaccination to avoid wearing a mask. So, again, this is giving you the parameters of what you can be doing. So that said, this presentation today is really a snapshot in time of what the current compliance landscape is and what the guidance is on these issues. But remember that this is all evolving, and you will want to continue to pay attention to what public health authorities are saying and what government agencies are saying, and really stay up to date on all of this. Public health experts are anticipating another wave of infections later this fall. And we know that, we've all seen the headlines about the Delta variant. So, keep an eye out for any updated guidance or changed requirements. And I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we really need to be flexible and adaptable. And so we might enter, a situation where infections in our communities ebb and flow, and we need to sort of be prepared to address that with our workplace policies and procedures. So that brings us to our final slide. If there are any additional questions we can answer for you, we have a few minutes left. And otherwise, thank you all for being with us today. And thanks for the great questions that we had throughout the presentation.
Thank you so much. It was really great to hear from you all. We've put the survey link in the chat, so please take a moment to let us know what you think. We'll keep the session open so you can do so. Thank you to our sponsors, Preti Flaherty and Maine Biz, and thank you to Ginn and Laura for the fabulous speakers and presentation. If anybody has any other questions, I'm quickly looking in the chat. We can come on video if you want and say hi, if you want to do that too.
There are a few questions that might be better for you to address. People are asking if the credits can be received for this training.
Do you guys have that ability?
I can certainly ask our marketing department to look into that.
Okay. Yep. So if we can, we will. And then we hope to see you guys Thursday, August 12th for our Stepping Up and Stepping Back program. We're going to do that at the Woodlands from 4 to 6. So 4 to 4:30, we'll have some beverages and hors d'oeuvres, and then it'll be an in-person event where we can see people again. So that'll be fun. And let me see. So you'll figure out about the credits and anything else, anybody else has? No? Perfect timing. We have a few minutes.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Have
guys.
a great day.
We'll leave it open. Have a
Thanks,
great day.
Laura.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye, Catherine.
Take care.
Bye. Thanks.